Timelines intertwined: Persia, Europe, and the making of the modern world. Introduction: A Century of Transition, 16 to 1700. The 17th century was a time of extraordinary political, intellectual, and technological change across the globe. In Persia, the Safavid Empire flourished early in the century, establishing the region as a cultural and economic hub. However, by the century's end, Persia's political and economic power had begun to wane, setting the stage for the internal and external challenges it would face in the following centuries. Meanwhile, Europe experienced profound transformations, driven by wars, revolutions, and the emergence of the scientific revolution and the Age of Enlightenment. Global trade expanded, fueled by European colonial empires, and technological advances reshaped industries and society. In this environment, the foundations of modern political and scientific thought were laid, with philosophers, scientists, writers, and industrialists leaving a lasting legacy. Persia in the 17th century, the height and decline of the Safavid Empire. The Safavid Empire peaked under the rule of Shah Abbas I, reigned 1588 to 1629, who transformed Isfahan into one of the most beautiful cities of its time. Under his leadership, Persia became a center for commerce, arts, and diplomacy. Shah Abbas forged alliances with European powers, encouraging trade through the Silk Road and establishing diplomatic relations with countries like England and the Netherlands. Persian carpets, ceramics, and silk were highly prized exports, reflecting the empire's wealth and artistic achievements. However, the stability of the Safavid Empire began to unravel in the second half of the 17th century. Internal corruption and the decline of strong leadership weakened the state, while regional revolts and pressure from the Ottoman Empire and Uzbek Khanate further eroded its power. By the end of the century, Persia was struggling to maintain control over its territories, setting the stage for the political instability that would characterize the early 18th century. European empires and political shifts. Europe in the 17th century was shaped by wars, political revolutions, and the rise of absolutist monarchies. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, devastated much of Central Europe, ending with the Peace of Westphalia, which established the modern concept of state sovereignty. In France, the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King, from 1643 to 1715 marked the height of absolutism. Louis centralized power in the monarchy, building the Palace of Versailles to reflect his authority, while expanding France's influence through wars and diplomacy. In England, the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, led to the execution of King Charles I and the brief establishment of a republic under Oliver Cromwell. The monarchy was restored in 1660, but tensions between the crown and parliament persisted, culminating in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. This revolution deposed King James II and installed William III and Mary II as joint monarchs, marking the beginning of a constitutional monarchy that limited royal power and enhanced the role of parliament. The rise of global trade and colonialism. The 17th century saw the rapid expansion of European empires. Spain, the Netherlands, Britain, and France established colonies across the Americas, Asia, and Africa, engaging in a fierce competition for resources and trade routes. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, became a dominant force in global trade, while England expanded its presence in India and the Caribbean. The economic systems of these empires were supported by the Atlantic slave trade, which connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a brutal network of exploitation. These colonial ventures laid the foundation for the rise of global capitalism, which would continue to shape world events in the centuries to come. The scientific revolution and technological innovation. The scientific revolution of the 17th century challenged traditional views of the natural world and laid the groundwork for modern science. In 1610, Galileo Galilei used a telescope to confirm Copernicus's heliocentric theory, proving that the Earth revolved around the Sun. His discoveries sparked conflict with the Catholic Church, but they marked a turning point in scientific thought. Isaac Newton's publication of Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica in 1687 revolutionized the understanding of physics with his laws of motion and universal gravitation. Meanwhile, René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, introduced the concept of rationalism in his works, famously declaring, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. The century also saw important technological innovations. In 1608, Hans Lippershey invented the telescope, revolutionizing astronomy. In 1656, Christian Huygens developed the pendulum clock, which significantly improved timekeeping accuracy. Antony van Leeuwenhoek advanced the field of microbiology in 1675 by observing microorganisms through a microscope. Cultural and literary achievements. The 17th century was also a golden age of literature and philosophy. In England, William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616, completed many of his greatest works in the early part of the century, including Hamlet and The Tempest. John Milton published Paradise Lost in 1667, an epic poem that reflected the religious and political upheavals of the time. In France, Molière wrote enduring comedies like Tartuffe and The Misanthrope, satirizing the hypocrisy of society. The philosopher Blaise Pascal explored the tension between reason and faith in his Pensées, while Jean-Baptiste Racine crafted classical tragedies. In Persia, the tradition of classical Persian poetry continued, with poets drawing inspiration from earlier masters like Hafez and Rumi. Though the century did not produce literary giants of the same stature, the cultural vibrancy of the Safavid court ensured the continuation of Persian artistic traditions. Key figures and inventions of the 17th century. Isaac Newton, 1643 to 1727, published the Principia, revolutionizing physics. Galileo Galilei, 1564 to 1642, confirmed the heliocentric model of the solar system. René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, developed the foundations of rationalism. Hans Lippershey invented the telescope in 1608. Antony van Leeuwenhoek advanced microbiology with the microscope in 1675. William Shakespeare and John Milton shaped English literature with their masterpieces. Molière and Racine transformed French theater. Conclusion: the world on the brink of modernity. The events of the 17th century laid the foundation for the transformations that would follow in the 18th and 19th centuries. Political revolutions, scientific discoveries, and literary achievements reflected a world in transition, as old structures gave way to new ways of thinking. In Persia, the decline of the Safavid Empire created a power vacuum that would lead to further upheavals in the 18th century. At the same time, European powers were consolidating their influence through colonialism and trade, reshaping the global economy and politics. As Persia entered the 18th century, it faced the challenge of maintaining its sovereignty in a rapidly changing world. The tension between tradition and modernity, which first emerged during this period, would shape the country's history for centuries to come. The story of these transformations begins with the fall of the Safavid Empire and the rise of Nader Shah, explored in the following chapter. Chapter 1. The Zand and Early Qajar Periods, 1750 to 1796. The mid-18th century was a time of political instability in Iran, with various factions vying for control after the collapse of the Safavid dynasty. The Zand dynasty emerged under Karim Khan Zand, who sought to restore stability and prosperity. However, after his death in 1779, the country plunged into chaos once more, eventually leading to the rise of the Qajar dynasty under Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar. During this period, global powers such as France and Britain sought to expand their influence, laying the groundwork for future competition in the region. Leaders including George III of Britain, Catherine the Great of Russia, and Louis XVI of France shaped their country's policies toward the Middle East, indirectly influencing the developments in Iran. The rise of Karim Khan Zand and a brief period of stability. In 1750, Karim Khan Zand seized power and established the Zand dynasty, based in Shiraz. Though he did not take the title of Shah, Karim Khan ruled as Vakil al-Ra'aya, advocate of the people, and sought to restore order after years of turmoil. He reduced taxes, encouraged trade, and maintained peaceful relations with neighboring powers. Karim Khan's policies brought a brief period of stability and prosperity. European merchants, particularly those from Britain, began expanding their trade networks in southern Iran, setting the stage for future economic competition. However, Karim Khan's death in 1779 left a power vacuum that plunged the country into civil war. The fragmentation of power and the decline of the Zand dynasty. After Karim Khan's death, Various factions within the Zand family vied for control. The lack of a strong central authority allowed regional warlords and tribal leaders to assert their independence, further fragmenting the country. The Zand dynasty quickly weakened as leaders fought for dominance, unable to unify the nation. During this period of internal conflict, Catherine the Great of Russia expanded her empire southward, increasing Russian influence in the Caucasus and along Iran's northern borders. Meanwhile, George III of Britain monitored developments in Iran, recognizing the strategic importance of the Persian Gulf for British trade routes to India. Aga Muhammad Khan and the rise of the Qajar dynasty. In the late 18th century, Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar, the leader of the Qajar tribe, began consolidating power in northern Iran. Known for his ruthlessness, Aga Muhammad Khan sought to reunify Iran under a centralized government. By 1794, he had defeated the last Zand ruler, Laf Ali Khan Zand, marking the end of the Zand dynasty. In 1796, Aga Muhammad Khan declared himself Shah, officially establishing the Qajar dynasty. His reign was marked by campaigns to suppress regional rebellions and consolidate power, but his brutal tactics alienated many of his subjects. Aga Muhammad Khan's efforts to restore order laid the foundation for the Qajar dynasty, though challenges would soon arise from both internal opposition and foreign interference. The global context, European expansion, and the Persian Gulf. The late 18th century was a period of significant change in global politics, as European powers expanded their colonial empires. Britain and France competed for influence in the Middle East, recognizing the strategic importance of Iran's location. The Persian Gulf emerged as a key area of interest for British merchants who sought to secure their trade routes to India. At the same time, Louis XVI in France dealt with growing domestic unrest that would eventually lead to the French Revolution. The changing global dynamics meant that Iran would soon become entangled in the rivalries between European powers, shaping the course of its modern history. Summary of key events, 1750 to 1796. Karim Khan Zand established the Zand dynasty in 1750, bringing a brief period of stability. The death of Karim Khan in 1779 led to civil war and the fragmentation of power. Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar defeated the Zand dynasty and established the Qajar dynasty in 1796. European powers, particularly Britain and Russia, began expanding their influence in the region. George III monitored developments in the Persian Gulf, seeking to protect British trade routes to India. Catherine the Great expanded Russian influence into the Caucasus, increasing pressure on Iran's northern borders. Louis XVI's reign in France ended with the outbreak of the French Revolution, reshaping global politics. The Persian Gulf emerged as a strategic area of interest for European merchants and powers. Conclusion: a new dynasty and emerging challenges. The period from 1750 to 1796 was one of political fragmentation and the rise of new leadership in Iran. The Zand dynasty provided a brief respite from turmoil, but internal conflicts following Karim Khan's death allowed new leaders to emerge. The rise of Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar marked the beginning of the Qajar dynasty, which would shape Iran's political landscape for over a century. As European powers expanded their influence in the region, Iran's strategic location became increasingly significant. The new Qajar rulers would face the challenge of balancing domestic stability with the growing pressure from foreign powers, setting the stage for future conflicts and reforms. Chapter 2: The Qajar Dynasty and Foreign Domination, 1796 to 1906. The Qajar dynasty ruled Iran from 1796 to 1925, a period marked by foreign interference, territorial losses, and economic decline. Throughout this era, Iran struggled to maintain sovereignty amid increasing pressure from Russia and Britain, both of whom sought to dominate Iranian territory and influence its political affairs. The Qajar rulers were unable to implement effective reforms, leading to rising internal discontent that culminated in the Constitutional Revolution of 1906. Global leaders of the period included Napoleon Bonaparte in France, George III and Queen Victoria in the United Kingdom, Tsar Alexander I and Nicholas II in Russia, and Abraham Lincoln and Grover Cleveland in the United States. Their policies shaped global dynamics, including the Great Game between Britain and Russia, which played out in Iran. The establishment of the Qajar dynasty. In 1796, Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar established the Qajar dynasty, reuniting Iran after years of civil war and political fragmentation. He moved the capital to Tehran and sought to centralize authority. However, Aga Muhammad Khan's brutal methods alienated many of his subjects, and his assassination in 1797 left the throne to his nephew, Fath Ali Shah Qajar. During Fath Ali Shah's reign, Iran became embroiled in conflicts with Russia over control of the Caucasus region. These wars ended in defeat for Iran, leading to the loss of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and parts of Armenia through the treaties of Gulistan 1813 and Turkmenchay 1828. These territorial losses weakened Iran and exposed the limitations of Qajar rule, foreign domination, and the Great Game. Throughout the 19th century, Iran found itself caught in the Great Game, a geopolitical struggle between Russia and Britain for influence in Central Asia. The British sought to use Iran as a buffer state to protect their interests in India, while Russia aimed to expand its territory southward. Both powers exploited Iran's political instability and economic weakness to assert their influence. The Qajar rulers, desperate for financial assistance, signed unequal treaties with foreign powers, granting them economic concessions. For example, in 1872, Nasser al-Din Shah Qajar granted a British entrepreneur, Baron Julius de Ruyter, the right to develop Iran's natural resources, including its railways and telegraphs. These concessions sparked resentment among Iranians, who saw them as a betrayal of national interests. Social changes and internal dissent. During the Qajar period, Iranian society began to experience significant changes. Western education and ideas entered the country, leading to the emergence of new intellectual currents and political activism. A growing middle class, composed of merchants, students, and clerics, began to demand reforms that would limit the power of the monarchy and reduce foreign influence. At the same time, Iran's traditional economy struggled to compete with imported goods from Europe. The growing dependence on foreign loans and concessions further deepened the economic crisis. By the late 19th century, protests against the Shah's policies had become more frequent, particularly in response to rising taxes and the sale of monopolies to foreign companies. The assassination of Nasser al-Din Shah and the path to revolution. In 1896, Nasser al-Din Shah was assassinated by Mirza Reza Kermani, a revolutionary influenced by nationalist and reformist ideas. His death symbolized the growing frustration with Qajar rule and the monarchy's failure to address the country's economic and political problems. His successor, Mozaffar al-Din Shah, was weak and indecisive, further deepening the political crisis. In the early 1900s, nationalist movements gained momentum, calling for the establishment of a constitution and a parliament, Majlis. The growing influence of European political ideas, combined with dissatisfaction with the Qajar monarchy's incompetence, set the stage for the constitutional revolution of 1906, marking the beginning of a new era in Iran's history. Summary of key events, 1796 to 1906. Aga Muhammad Khan established the Qajar dynasty in 1796, unifying Iran. Iran lost significant territory to Russia through the treaties of Gulistan and Turkmenchay. Britain and Russia competed for influence in Iran as part of the Great Game. The Qajar rulers signed unequal treaties and granted concessions to foreign powers, deepening public resentment. Nasser al-Din Shah was assassinated in 1896, symbolizing growing opposition to the monarchy. Napoleon Bonaparte influenced regional politics, with Iran briefly aligning with France against Russia and Britain. George III and Queen Victoria shaped British policy toward Iran, focusing on protecting British interests in India. Tsar Nicholas I and Tsar Alexander II expanded Russian influence into the Caucasus and Central Asia. Abraham Lincoln's and Grover Cleveland's presidencies were marked by limited U.S. involvement in Iranian affairs. Conclusion: the beginning of change. The period between 1796 and 1906 was marked by the rise and decline of the Qajar dynasty. Iran's struggles with foreign interference, economic mismanagement, and territorial losses exposed the weaknesses of the monarchy. While the Qajar rulers sought to modernize the country, their reliance on foreign powers and inability to implement effective reforms led to widespread disillusionment. The assassination of Nasser al-Din Shah and the growing demand for political change set the stage for the constitutional revolution, which would transform Iran's political landscape. The next chapter of Iran's history would see the people rise to demand accountability and sovereignty, ushering in a new era of struggle for freedom and self-determination. Chapter 3: Constitutional Revolution and the Struggle for Sovereignty, 1906 to 1920. The Constitutional Revolution of 1906 marked a turning point in Iran's history, as it introduced the first attempt at limiting monarchical power through a constitution. However, the early years of Iran's constitutional experiment were marked by foreign interference, internal struggles, and economic hardship. The monarchy sought to regain control, while nationalist movements pushed for political reform and sovereignty. This turbulent period set the stage for the eventual rise of Reza Khan and the creation of the Pahlavi dynasty. Global leaders influencing these events included Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson in the United States, Herbert Asquith and David Lloyd George in the United Kingdom, Raymond Poincaré in France, and Tsar Nicholas II and Vladimir Lenin in Russia. These leaders shaped their nations' responses to Iran's political developments, especially during the Great War and the post-war period. The Constitutional Revolution, a quest for reform. In 1906, widespread frustration with the absolute power of the Qajar monarchy, foreign interference, and economic instability led to the Constitutional Revolution. Activists, clerics, and intellectuals demanded the creation of a parliament majlis and the establishment of a constitution to limit the authority of the Shah. The revolution succeeded in forcing Mozaffar al-Din Shah Qajar to sign the constitution, but he died shortly after. His successor, Muhammad Ali Shah, opposed the reforms and sought to reassert his power. Muhammad Ali Shah attempted to dissolve the Majlis in 1908 with the help of Cossack brigade forces, leading to violent clashes between monarchists and constitutionalists. After 2 years of struggle, the Shah was deposed, and his young son, Ahmad Shah Qajar, was placed on the throne, though real power remained with the Majlis and nationalist leaders. Foreign interference and economic struggles. Despite the promise of the constitutional revolution, Iran faced significant challenges from foreign powers. Britain and Russia divided the country into spheres of influence through the 1907 Anglo-Russian Agreement, undermining Iran's sovereignty. The United Kingdom sought to control Iran's oil resources, while Russia maintained military and political dominance in the north. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 further complicated matters, as Iran's strategic location made it a battleground for competing powers. Although Iran declared neutrality, British, Russian, and Ottoman forces occupied various parts of the country, causing widespread destruction. David Lloyd George in Britain and Raymond Poincaré in France coordinated their efforts to secure resources and supply lines, further entrenching foreign influence in Iran. The aftermath of World War I and the struggle for sovereignty. Following the end of World War I, Iran faced economic hardship, political instability, and growing nationalist sentiment. The war devastated the economy, leading to famine and disease that killed thousands. In the north, Russian troops continued to occupy Iranian territory, while the British expanded their influence in the south. The Russian Revolution of 1917 and the rise of Vladimir Lenin temporarily reduced Russia's presence in Iran, as Soviet leaders withdrew troops to focus on domestic challenges. However, Britain filled the power vacuum, hoping to formalize its control through the Anglo-Persian Agreement of 1919. The agreement, negotiated under the leadership of David Lloyd George, sparked outrage among Iranian nationalists, who saw it as a betrayal of their sovereignty. Nationalist movements and the decline of the Qajar dynasty. In response to foreign interference, nationalist leaders organized protests and campaigns to demand greater control over Iran's resources and political affairs. Figures like Sadr Khan and Bagher Khan emerged as heroes of the resistance, leading movements that demanded the withdrawal of foreign troops and the preservation of Iran's independence. The young Ahmad Shah Qajar struggled to maintain authority as nationalist movements gained strength. His government was unable to address the growing unrest, and political factions within the Majlis fought for control. The increasing instability paved the way for Reza Khan, a rising military figure, to seize power in 1921, marking the end of the Qajar dynasty's influence. Summary of key events, 1906 to 1920. The Constitutional Revolution of 1906 established Iran's first constitution and parliament. Muhammad Ali Shah attempted to dissolve the parliament, sparking a violent struggle. Britain and Russia divided Iran into spheres of influence through the Anglo-Russian Agreement of 1907. World War I devastated Iran's economy, and foreign troops occupied large parts of the country. The Anglo-Persian Agreement of 1919 sparked nationalist opposition to British influence. Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson shaped U.S. foreign policy during this period, though U.S. involvement in Iran remained limited. David Lloyd George sought to formalize British control over Iran through the Anglo-Persian Agreement. Vladimir Lenin's withdrawal of Russian troops from Iran created a power vacuum filled by British influence. Nationalist movements emerged to resist foreign control and restore Iran's sovereignty. Conclusion: the struggle for sovereignty from 1906 to 1920 was one of intense political struggle and foreign interference. The Constitutional Revolution introduced a new era of political reform, but it also exposed deep divisions within Iranian society. The constant interference of Britain and Russia undermined efforts to build a stable constitutional government, while economic hardship and war further weakened the country. As nationalist movements gained momentum, the Qajar dynasty lost legitimacy, creating an opportunity for new leaders to rise. The collapse of the monarchy paved the way for Reza Khan to seize power, ushering in a new chapter in Iran's history. However, the challenges of balancing modernization with political independence would continue to shape the nation's future. Chapter 4: Iran. During the two world wars, 1920 to 1945, the period between 1920 and 1945 was defined by global upheaval as two world wars reshaped the political and economic landscape. Iran, though officially neutral in both conflicts, found itself deeply affected by the global struggle for power. With its strategic location and rich oil resources, Iran attracted the interest of Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and later, the United States. During this period, the rise of Reza Khan to power and his transformation into Reza Shah Pahlavi laid the foundations of modern Iran, though authoritarianism and external pressures shaped the challenges the country would face. Global leaders during this period included Woodrow Wilson and Franklin D. Roosevelt in the United States, David Lloyd George, Stanley Baldwin, Neville Chamberlain, and Winston Churchill in the United Kingdom, and Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. In France, leadership alternated between Raymond Poincaré and later Albert Lebrun, with the political landscape deeply affected by the two wars. Iran's struggles and the rise of Reza Khan. In the aftermath of World War I, Iran was in a state of political and economic disarray. The Qajar dynasty had lost legitimacy, and the country faced severe financial instability and regional separatist movements. In 1921, Reza Khan, a military officer, seized power through a coup, establishing himself as a dominant political figure. By 1925, he abolished the Qajar dynasty and became Reza Shah Pahlavi, marking the beginning of the Pahlavi dynasty. Reza Shah's vision was to modernize and centralize Iran. He focused on building a national army, expanding infrastructure, and promoting industrial development. His reforms also aimed to weaken the power of the clergy and promote secular education. However, his authoritarian rule alienated many sectors of society, laying the groundwork for future opposition. Iran in World War II, occupation and the abdication of Reza Shah. Though Iran declared neutrality during World War II, the Allies viewed the country as strategically important. Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin sought control over Iran's oil resources and transportation routes, essential for supplying the Soviet Union. In 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran, deposing Reza Shah and forcing him into exile. His son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, was installed as a more compliant ruler. The occupation allowed the Allies to use the Trans-Iranian Railway to transport supplies to the Soviet front. While Iran officially remained neutral, the invasion disrupted the country's economy and sparked resentment among Iranians. Franklin D. Roosevelt played a key role in securing cooperation between the Allies and Iran, helping to ensure the safe flow of supplies during the war. The impact of the Allied presence and internal tensions. The presence of British, Soviet, and American forces created tension within Iran. The Allies promised to respect Iran's sovereignty and withdraw after the war, but Soviet forces lingered, particularly in the northern provinces, where they supported separatist movements. This led to the Iran crisis of 1946, marking one of the first major confrontations of the emerging Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Internally, Mohammad Reza Shah struggled to consolidate power. Political factions vied for influence, and economic hardship increased public frustration. Food shortages, inflation, and labor strikes destabilized the fragile government, creating a climate of uncertainty. At the same time, nationalist movements began to emerge, demanding greater control over Iran's resources and reduced foreign influence. Cultural shifts and the rise of nationalism. The occupation during World War II exposed Iran to new political ideologies and cultural trends. Nationalist leaders, intellectuals, and students increasingly criticized the monarchy's close ties with foreign powers. The demand for nationalization of Iran's oil resources grew, laying the groundwork for future confrontations with Britain and the United States. Western cultural influence also deepened during this period, with many Iranians adopting European styles of dress, education, and social norms. However, these changes were met with resistance from conservative elements, particularly the clergy, who viewed Westernization as a threat to Islamic values. Summary of key events, 1920 to 1945. Reza Khan seized power through a coup in 1921 and became Reza Shah Pahlavi in 1925. Reza Shah's modernization efforts centralized power but alienated many segments of society. Iran declared neutrality during World War II but was invaded by British and Soviet forces in 1941. Reza Shah abdicated, and Mohammad Reza Shah was installed as the new ruler under Allied supervision. The Allies used Iran as a supply route during World War II, with cooperation from Franklin D. Roosevelt. Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin coordinated efforts to secure Iran's oil and transportation routes. The occupation fueled nationalist movements, demanding greater control over Iran's resources. The Iran crisis of 1946 marked the beginning of Cold War tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Conclusion: a nation in transition. The period between 1920 and 1945 was one of profound change for Iran. The rise of Reza Shah Pahlavi ushered in an era of modernization, but his authoritarian rule alienated many Iranians. The Allied occupation during World War II disrupted the country's economy and fueled resentment toward foreign powers, setting the stage for future conflicts over national sovereignty and resources. As Mohammad Reza Shah assumed the throne under Allied supervision, Iran entered a new phase of political uncertainty. The seeds of nationalism and opposition to foreign influence planted during this period would grow in the years to come, culminating in future struggles that would reshape the nation. Chapter 5: The Rise of the Pahlavi Dynasty and the Road to Modernization, 1925 to 1963. The Pahlavi dynasty was established in 1925 when Reza Khan became Reza Shah Pahlavi, marking the beginning of a new era in Iran. His reign and that of his son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, focused on modernization, centralization of power, and secular reforms. However, these efforts were accompanied by growing authoritarianism, which sowed the seeds of opposition. The Pahlavi rulers sought to align Iran with Western powers, drawing closer to the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, while navigating regional and global challenges. Global leadership during this period included Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry Truman in the United States, Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee in the United Kingdom, Charles de Gaulle in France, and Konrad Adenauer in West Germany. Their policies influenced Iran's development and its role in the region, especially during the turbulent years of World War II and the early Cold War. Reza Shah's modernization and authoritarian rule. Reza Shah Pahlavi, a former military officer, came to power in 1925 with a vision to modernize and centralize Iran. He built new roads, railways, and industries while establishing a modern education system. Secular laws replaced Islamic courts, and new institutions such as national banks and universities were introduced. Reza Shah's reforms aimed to reduce the influence of the clergy and tribal leaders, consolidating power in the hands of the central government. However, these modernization efforts were accompanied by authoritarianism. Political opposition was ruthlessly suppressed, and freedom of the press was curtailed. Reza Shah banned the traditional Islamic veil for women and required all men to wear Western-style clothing, which alienated many conservative Iranians. World War II and Allied occupation of Iran. Iran declared neutrality during World War II, but its strategic location and oil resources attracted the attention of the Allies. In 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran, forcing Reza Shah to abdicate in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Shah. The occupation allowed the Allies to secure a supply route to the Soviet Union while ensuring access to Iran's oil. Franklin D. Roosevelt in the United States, Winston Churchill in the United Kingdom, and Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union coordinated efforts to maintain control over Iran during the war. Despite assurances that they would leave after the war, the Soviet Union delayed its withdrawal, sparking the Iran crisis of 1946, one of the first confrontations of the Cold War. The rise of Mohammad Reza Shah and Cold War politics. After the war, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi sought to reassert control and modernize Iran further, but his early reign was marked by political instability. The nationalization of Iran's oil industry in 1951 by Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh led to a major confrontation with Britain and the United States. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, backed by the British government, opposed the nationalization, leading to a boycott of Iranian oil exports. In 1953, the CIA and MI6 orchestrated a coup that removed Mossadegh from power and restored Mohammad Reza Shah to the throne. Dwight D. Eisenhower in the United States and Winston Churchill in the UK saw the coup as necessary to prevent Iran from falling under Soviet influence. The coup marked the beginning of a close alliance between Iran and the West, but it also deepened resentment among many Iranians who viewed the Shah as a puppet of foreign powers. The Shah's consolidation of power and the early Cold War with Mossadegh removed, the Shah consolidated his power, relying on the Savak, Iran's secret police, to suppress opposition. Political parties were banned and dissent was crushed. At the same time, the Shah embarked on ambitious modernization projects, focusing on education, infrastructure, and economic development. Iran's oil revenues provided the funds for these initiatives, but wealth was concentrated among the elite, leaving many Iranians in poverty. Iran's close relationship with the West made it a key player in the Cold War. John F. Kennedy encouraged the Shah to introduce political reforms and improve human rights, but these efforts were half-hearted and failed to address the underlying grievances of the population. Konrad Adenauer in West Germany and Charles de Gaulle in France also sought to strengthen economic ties with Iran, viewing it as an important ally in the region. Cultural tensions and opposition movements. Despite the Shah's modernization efforts, cultural tensions persisted between traditional and modern elements of Iranian society. The Shah's promotion of Western culture alienated many religious leaders and conservative citizens. Ayatollah Khomeini emerged as a vocal critic of the regime, condemning the Shah's secular policies and alignment with Western powers. By the early 1960s, opposition to the Shah's rule had grown. Students, intellectuals, and clerics joined forces in protests against government repression and foreign influence. The White Revolution, a series of reforms introduced by the Shah in 1963, aimed to modernize Iran further, but it also intensified opposition, particularly among the clergy. Summary of key events, 1925 to 1963. Reza Shah Pahlavi came to power in 1925, initiating a program of modernization and secularization. Iran was occupied by British and Soviet forces during World War II, forcing Reza Shah to abdicate. Mohammad Reza Shah's reign began with instability, marked by the 1953 coup that ousted Mossadegh. The Shah consolidated power with the support of the Savak and Western allies, focusing on modernization. Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill coordinated the Allied occupation of Iran during World War II. The CIA and MI6 orchestrated the 1953 coup with support from Dwight D. Eisenhower and Churchill. John F. Kennedy encouraged political reform in Iran, though the Shah's efforts were limited. Konrad Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle sought to maintain strong economic ties with Iran. Conclusion: the path toward change. The period from 1925 to 1963 laid the foundations for both modernization and discontent in Iran. While Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah pursued ambitious reforms, their authoritarian rule alienated large segments of the population. The close alignment with Western powers deepened resentment among many Iranians, setting the stage for future conflicts. The Shah's inability to reconcile modernization with cultural and political demands created an atmosphere of tension that would grow in the years to come. As opposition movements gained momentum, the Pahlavi dynasty faced increasing challenges, paving the way for the revolutionary upheaval that would reshape Iran's future. Chapter 6: The Fall of the Monarchy and the Road to Revolution, 1963 to 1979. The period between 1963 and 1979 was marked by growing discontent with the Pahlavi regime. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi pursued rapid modernization and secular reforms through the White Revolution, but these changes alienated many segments of Iranian society. Political repression, economic inequality, and the Shah's close ties with Western powers led to widespread opposition, setting the stage for the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Globally, key political leaders shaped the period's developments. In the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter all navigated the Cold War and managed relations with Iran. In France, Charles de Gaulle and Georges Pompidou held office before being succeeded by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. In the United Kingdom, Harold Wilson, Edward Heath, and James Callaghan led through shifting domestic and global conditions, while Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt governed West Germany during this transformative era. The White Revolution and growing discontent. In 1963, Mohammad Reza Shah introduced the White Revolution, a series of economic and social reforms intended to modernize Iran. These reforms included land redistribution, women's suffrage, and the nationalization of forests and pastures. While they aimed to transform Iran into a modern state, the reforms alienated traditional landowners, the clergy, and many rural citizens. The clergy, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, became vocal critics of the Shah's policies. Khomeini condemned the regime's secularism and westernization, accusing the Shah of undermining Islamic values. In 1963, he was arrested and exiled, but his influence continued to grow from abroad, laying the ideological groundwork for the Islamic Revolution. Political repression and economic inequality. Despite efforts to modernize, political repression under the Shah's regime deepened public resentment. The Savak, Iran's secret police, suppressed dissent and imprisoned opposition leaders. Political parties were banned, and civil liberties were curtailed, creating an atmosphere of fear and oppression. At the same time, economic inequality increased, despite the oil boom of the 1970s. While the Shah's government enjoyed rising oil revenues, wealth remained concentrated among the elite, leaving many Iranians in poverty. The growing divide between the wealthy elite and the working class fueled anger and disillusionment, especially in urban areas. Shifting global alliances and regional politics. Iran's close relationship with the West, particularly the United States, became a focal point of criticism. Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon supported the Shah as a key ally in the Cold War, viewing Iran as a bulwark against Soviet influence in the Middle East. The Shah's purchase of advanced military equipment from the U.S. further cemented the alliance. However, growing dependence on the West led to resentment among Iranians, who viewed the Shah as a puppet of foreign powers. Jimmy Carter, who took office in 1977, attempted to balance support for the Shah with calls for human rights, but his mixed messages weakened the regime. In Europe, leaders like Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in France and Helmut Schmidt in West Germany sought to maintain economic ties with Iran, despite concerns about political repression. Cultural changes and the rise of opposition movements. The Shah's westernization policies sparked cultural tensions within Iranian society. Traditional religious values clashed with the secularism promoted by the government. The ban on public veiling, Western-style education reforms, and the promotion of Western culture alienated many Iranians, particularly the conservative clergy and rural populations. Opposition movements gained momentum throughout the 1970s. leftist groups, student activists, and religious leaders mobilized against the regime. Ayatollah Khomeini's sermons, recorded and smuggled into Iran from exile, inspired widespread resistance. The increasing repression by Savak only intensified opposition efforts, culminating in nationwide strikes and demonstrations. The collapse of the Shah's regime. By 1978, mass protests erupted across Iran, with demonstrators demanding an end to the monarchy and the establishment of a more just and representative government. The Shah responded with martial law and violent crackdowns, but these measures failed to quell the unrest. In the face of mounting opposition and waning support from his Western allies, the Shah fled Iran in January 1979. His departure marked the collapse of the monarchy and paved the way for the return of Ayatollah Khomeini from exile. Within weeks, the monarchy was formally abolished and the Islamic Republic was established. Global developments and technological changes. The 1960s and 1970s were periods of significant global transformation. The Cold War dominated international relations, with the US and Soviet Union competing for influence in every region, including the Middle East. Technological advancements, such as the launch of the first personal computers and innovations in telecommunications, began reshaping economies and societies worldwide. Iran, however, remained focused on internal developments and did not fully engage with the technological changes sweeping the globe. The revolution of 1979 would further isolate the country, cutting it off from many of the technological advances of the time. Summary of key events, 1963 to 1979. The White Revolution introduced sweeping reforms but alienated many Iranians. Political repression under the Shah deepened public discontent and fueled opposition. The Shah maintained close ties with Western powers, particularly the US, but alienated large segments of society. Mass protests in 1978 to 1979 forced the Shah to flee, leading to the collapse of the monarchy. Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter shaped U.S. policy toward Iran during this period. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in France and Helmut Schmidt in Germany balanced economic interests with concerns over political repression. Cultural tensions between secular and religious values intensified opposition to the Shah's regime. Technological advancements, including early personal computers, reshaped global economies and societies. Conclusion: the path to revolution. The period between 1963 and 1979 set the stage for the Islamic Revolution. The Shah's ambitious modernization efforts and alignment with Western powers alienated many Iranians, while political repression and economic inequality fueled opposition. The rise of Ayatollah Khomeini as a revolutionary leader provided a unifying ideology for those seeking to overthrow the monarchy. By 1979, the Shah's regime was no longer sustainable. His departure marked the end of centuries of monarchy in Iran and the beginning of a new era. However, the revolution would also plunge the country into years of upheaval, reshaping Iran's relationship with the world and setting the stage for future conflicts. Chapter 7: The Birth of the Islamic Republic, 1979. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 transformed Iran's political, social, and economic landscape, marking the end of the Pahlavi monarchy and the beginning of a theocratic republic. Ayatollah Khomeini, exiled for much of his life, returned to lead the revolution and became the face of the new government. The revolution not only reshaped Iran, but also had significant consequences for the Middle East and the global order. At the time, the world was watching with concern. Jimmy Carter in the United States struggled to manage the fallout from the revolution. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in France, who had allowed Khomeini to stay in exile in the country, observed the transition closely. In the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister later in 1979, setting the tone for a close alignment with U.S. foreign policy. Helmut Schmidt in West Germany sought to maintain economic ties while navigating the complexities of Iran's political upheaval. The fall of the Shah and the rise of Khomeini. In January 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran, fled the country as protests and strikes paralyzed the nation. For years, opposition to the Shah's regime had grown due to economic inequality, political repression, and his close ties with the West. The revolution was fueled by a coalition of secular liberals, communists, and religious leaders, but it was Khomeini's vision of an Islamic government that ultimately prevailed. On February 1, 1979, Khomeini returned to Iran to a hero's welcome. Within weeks, the monarchy was abolished, and Khomeini began consolidating power, sidelining secular and leftist factions. A referendum was held in April, establishing the Islamic Republic with Khomeini as the supreme leader. The U.S. hostage crisis and international isolation. In November 1979, a group of Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage. The students demanded the return of the Shah, who had been admitted to the U.S. for medical treatment, to face trial in Iran. The hostage crisis lasted 444 days, severely straining relations between Iran and the U.S. President Jimmy Carter imposed economic sanctions on Iran and tried unsuccessfully to negotiate the release of the hostages. A rescue attempt, Operation Eagle Claw, ended in disaster, further damaging Carter and contributing to his defeat in the 1980 election. Margaret Thatcher, who had just taken office in the UK, supported Carter's efforts to isolate Iran diplomatically. The Islamic Republic's early challenges. The establishment of the Islamic Republic did not bring peace or stability to Iran. Internal power struggles emerged between theocratic hardliners and secular revolutionaries, with Khomeini working to eliminate opposition. Many former allies of the revolution were imprisoned or executed, including supporters of secular parties and the Communist Tudeh Party. Meanwhile, the economy, already weakened by strikes during the revolution, continued to deteriorate. Iran's oil exports plummeted, leading to inflation and shortages of basic goods. Helmut Schmidt in West Germany sought to preserve economic ties with Iran, though political relations became increasingly strained. Regional impact and the spread of revolutionary ideals. The Islamic Revolution sent shockwaves throughout the Middle East. Khomeini's calls for Islamic governance and opposition to monarchies alarmed neighboring countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, which feared the spread of revolutionary fervor. In the years that followed, Iran sought to export its revolutionary ideals, supporting Islamist movements in Lebanon, Iraq, and beyond. The revolution also affected the Cold War dynamics. Both the United States and the Soviet Union viewed the rise of the Islamic Republic with suspicion, though Iran's leaders declared their opposition to both superpowers. Iran's anti-Western stance aligned with broader global movements calling for an end to Western imperialism, though it left the new republic isolated on the world stage. Technological context and global shifts. The year 1979 was also significant for global technological developments. Sony released the first Walkman, revolutionizing personal music consumption. The microcomputer revolution was underway, with companies like Apple and IBM laying the groundwork for the personal computing era. Despite these advances, Iran's focus remained inward, grappling with political upheaval and economic challenges. The country's isolation from the West meant that it did not fully participate in the technological changes that were reshaping global societies. Summary of key events, 1979. The Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah and established the Islamic Republic. Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran and became the supreme leader. The U.S. Embassy hostage crisis strained relations between Iran and the United States. Margaret Thatcher aligned the UK with U.S. efforts to isolate Iran. Helmut Schmidt in West Germany sought to maintain economic ties despite political tensions. Jimmy Carter struggled with the fallout from the revolution, leading to his political decline. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in France observed the transition closely, having hosted Khomeini in exile. The Middle East was destabilized by the spread of revolutionary ideals and fears of regime change. Technological advances, including the Sony Walkman, marked the beginning of a new era in personal technology. Conclusion: a new era for Iran and the world. The year 1979 was a turning point in Iranian history, marking the end of the Pahlavi monarchy and the rise of the Islamic Republic. Khomeini's leadership set the course for decades of political repression and economic hardship, though the revolutionary ideals resonated with many inside and outside Iran. The revolution not only reshaped Iran, but also altered the geopolitical landscape, creating tensions that would define the region for years to come. As the new republic struggled to establish itself, It faced hostility from the West and skepticism from neighboring countries. The U.S. hostage crisis symbolized the breakdown of relations between Iran and the world, setting the stage for a long era of confrontation and isolation. Chapter 8: War, Sanctions, and Survival, 1979 to 1989. The first decade of the Islamic Republic of Iran was marked by intense internal and external challenges. Following the 1979 revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini established a new theocratic government, consolidating power and suppressing opposition groups. Iran faced isolation internationally and soon found itself in a devastating war with Iraq, lasting 8 years and reshaping the country's future. During this period, global leadership played a key role in shaping Iran's relations with the world. Jimmy Carter in the United States initially attempted to manage the fallout from the revolution, while Ronald Reagan adopted a more confrontational approach. In France, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing was followed by François Mitterrand, who sought a more balanced foreign policy toward Iran. In the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher remained aligned with U.S. policies, while in Germany, leaders grappled with shifting alliances as the Cold War continued. Consolidation of power and political repression. After the revolution, Khomeini's followers moved quickly to consolidate power, sidelining secular and leftist factions that had initially supported the overthrow of the Shah. The new government established institutions such as the Guardian Council, ensuring that laws adhered to Islamic principles. A series of purges targeted political opponents, including former allies and supporters of the Shah. The revolutionary government also cracked down on the press, restricted civil liberties, and imposed strict religious laws. Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Jimmy Carter in the US monitored the situation with concern, particularly after the storming of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in 1979, which resulted in a prolonged hostage crisis. The Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988. In 1980, Iraq under Saddam Hussein launched an invasion of Iran, seeking to exploit Iran's post-revolutionary instability and gain control of the oil-rich province of Khuzestan. The war became one of the most destructive conflicts of the 20th century, killing hundreds of thousands and leaving both countries deeply scarred. During the war, Iran found itself diplomatically isolated. Ronald Reagan provided support to Iraq despite the U.S. public's animosity towards Saddam, believing it was necessary to contain Iran's influence. Margaret Thatcher also aligned with U.S. policy, supporting Iraq's efforts to prevent Iran's regional expansion. Meanwhile, François Mitterrand in France sought to maintain a delicate balance by offering limited support to Iraq while remaining open to diplomacy with Iran. The war devastated Iran's economy, damaged infrastructure, and displaced millions of people. Iraq used chemical weapons against Iranian forces, deepening the tragedy of the conflict. Despite heavy losses, Iran managed to repel the Iraqi invasion, turning the war into a brutal war of attrition that lasted till 1988. Economic struggles and sanctions. Throughout the war, Iran faced severe economic challenges, compounded by international sanctions imposed by the U.S. and its allies. The seizure of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and the hostage crisis further strained relations with the West. Reagan's administration tightened sanctions, cutting Iran off from global markets and preventing access to advanced technology and financial resources. Iran developed a wartime economy, promoting self-reliance through agriculture and state-run industries. However, inflation soared and basic goods were often in short supply. Margaret Thatcher's government supported these sanctions, while Mitterrand sought to prevent further deterioration in relations by urging diplomatic engagement. Global context, the Cold War, and regional conflicts. The 1980s were a turbulent period globally, defined by the final stages of the Cold War. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union and Reagan's strategic pressure helped bring about the collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. Amid these developments, Iran remained ideologically committed to opposing both the West and the Soviet bloc, carving out its own revolutionary path. Advances in personal computing during the 1980s also laid the groundwork for the digital revolution. In 1981, IBM released its first personal computer, and Apple began its rise as a technological giant. These changes reshaped economies and societies worldwide, though Iran's isolation kept it from fully participating in these technological transformations. The end of the war and the death of Khomeini. In 1988, after years of stalemate, Iran agreed to a ceasefire brokered by the United Nations. The war ended with no territorial gains for either side, leaving both nations deeply wounded. Iran emerged from the conflict with a devastated economy and shattered infrastructure, yet its leadership remained committed to the revolutionary ideals that had guided it through the war. In 1989, Ayatollah Khomeini died, marking the end of an era. His death raised questions about the future of the Islamic Republic. Ali Khamenei was appointed as the new supreme leader, despite lacking Khomeini's religious stature. The transition of power ushered in a new phase of governance, focused on rebuilding the economy and reasserting Iran's regional influence. Summary of key events, 1979 to 1989. The Islamic Republic consolidated power through political purges and repression. The Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, devastated Iran's economy and infrastructure. Sanctions imposed by the U.S. and its allies isolated Iran economically. Ayatollah Khomeini died in 1989, and Ali Khamenei succeeded him as supreme leader. Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan shaped U.S. policy toward Iran, focusing on sanctions and containment. François Mitterrand in France sought diplomatic engagement, while Margaret Thatcher aligned with U.S. policies. The Cold War neared its end, with Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms reshaping global politics. Advances in personal computing and technology transformed global economies. Conclusion: survival and transition. The decade following the 1979 revolution was one of war, isolation, and survival for Iran. Despite facing overwhelming challenges, the Islamic Republic endured, emerging from the Iran-Iraq War with its revolutionary ideals intact. However, the human and economic toll of the conflict left lasting scars on the nation. The death of Ayatollah Khomeini in 1989 marked the end of an era, but the challenges for Iran were far from over. The new leadership under Ali Khamenei and Ali Akbar Rafsanjani would have to navigate a rapidly changing global landscape, balancing the need for economic recovery with the desire to maintain the Islamic Republic's ideological foundations. Chapter 9: Reconstruction, Reform, and Regional Influence, 1989 to 2005. The post-war period in Iran was defined by the need to rebuild the nation's economy and infrastructure following the devastation of the Iran-Iraq War. The death of Ayatollah Khomeini in 1989 raised hopes for economic reform and political change. Ali Khamenei was appointed as the new supreme leader, while Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani became president, focusing on reconstruction and modernization. During this period, global leadership saw significant changes. George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton in the United States, François Mitterrand and Jacques Chirac in France, John Major and Tony Blair in the United Kingdom, and Helmut Kohl and Gerhard Schroeder in Germany each shaped their nation's foreign policies toward Iran. Despite Iran's efforts to rebuild and reintegrate into the global community, tensions remained over regional influence and human rights. Rafsanjani's presidency and economic reconstruction. Rafsanjani's presidency, which spanned from 1989 to 1997, focused on economic reconstruction. His government promoted privatization, foreign investment, and the development of key industries to revive the economy. Despite these efforts, economic progress was uneven, and many Iranians struggled with inflation, unemployment, and inequality. Rafsanjani's reform agenda also faced resistance from conservative factions who feared the erosion of the Islamic Republic's core values. During this time, François Mitterrand in France and Helmut Kohl in Germany sought to engage Iran diplomatically, balancing economic cooperation with concerns over Iran's human rights record and regional activities. Khatami's reforms and the rise of the reformist movement. In 1997, Mohammad Khatami was elected president, ushering in a new era of reform and political openness. Khatami's presidency reflected widespread frustration with political repression and economic stagnation. His administration promoted civil liberties, freedom of the press, and dialogue with the West, offering hope for meaningful change. Khatami also introduced the policy of dialogue among civilizations, calling for improved relations between Iran and the international community. Bill Clinton in the United States and Tony Blair in the United Kingdom cautiously welcomed these overtures, though tensions over Iran's nuclear ambitions and regional activities remained. Khatami's reforms faced significant resistance from hardliners within the government, limiting his ability to implement lasting change. Regional influence and tensions with the West. During the 1990s and early 2000s, Iran expanded its influence in the Middle East, supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Palestine, and Shia militias in Iraq. This growing influence heightened tensions with the United States and its allies, who viewed Iran as a destabilizing force in the region. Iran's support for armed groups and its pursuit of nuclear technology became central concerns for Western governments. The rise of George W. Bush to the U.S. presidency in 2001 introduced a more confrontational approach toward Iran. After the September 11 attacks, Bush labeled Iran part of the axis of evil, further straining relations. At the same time, Jacques Chirac in France and Gerhard Schroeder in Germany sought to engage Iran diplomatically, though they struggled to reconcile economic cooperation with political tensions. Global developments and technological advancements. The 1990s and early 2000s were marked by profound technological changes. The growth of the Internet, the rise of personal computers, and the advent of mobile phones transformed communication and commerce. Companies like Microsoft, Apple, and Google emerged as major players, laying the foundation for the digital age. In Iran, young people embraced new technologies despite government censorship, using them to connect with the world and express political opinions. Culturally, the 1990s saw the spread of global pop music, cinema, and fashion. Iranian artists and filmmakers, including Abbas Kiarostami, gained international recognition, contributing to a vibrant cultural scene that thrived despite state censorship. The 2003 Iraq War and shifting regional dynamics. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 dramatically altered the regional balance of power. The fall of Saddam Hussein, a longtime enemy of Iran, created new opportunities for Iran to expand its influence in Iraq. Iranian-backed Shia militias gained power, and Iran emerged as a key player in shaping post-war Iraq's political landscape. The Iraq War also deepened tensions between Iran and the United States. George W. Bush's administration accused Iran of supporting insurgents in Iraq, further straining relations. Meanwhile, European leaders, including Jacques Chirac and Gerhard Schroeder, sought to prevent the conflict from escalating into a broader regional war. Summary of key events, 1989 to 2005. Ali Khamenei became supreme leader in 1989, consolidating power over the state. Ali Akbar Rafsanjani's presidency, 1989-97, focused on economic reconstruction. Mohammad Khamenei's election in 1997 ushered in a brief period of reform and openness. Iran expanded its regional influence in Iraq, Lebanon, and Palestine. George H.W. Bush pursued a cautious approach toward Iran, while Bill Clinton engaged cautiously with Khatami's reformist government. Tony Blair in the UK and François Mitterrand in France supported diplomatic engagement with Iran, though concerns over regional activities persisted. The Iraq War in 2003 created new opportunities for Iran to expand its influence in the region. Technological advancements and cultural shifts transformed global communication and commerce. Conclusion: a time of reconstruction, and the period from 1989 to 2005 was one of reconstruction, reform, and rising regional influence for Iran. While leaders like Rafsanjani and Khatami sought to rebuild the economy and open the political system, their efforts were limited by opposition from conservative factions. The reform movement's failure to deliver significant change left many Iranians disillusioned, setting the stage for a return to conservatism. At the same time, Iran's regional influence expanded, fueled by the power vacuums created by the Iraq War. Global technological advancements reshaped communication and culture, offering new opportunities for expression and activism. As Iran navigated these changes, it faced the challenge of balancing tradition with modernity while maintaining its ideological commitments. Chapter 10: Ahmadinejad, Nuclear Tensions and Global Confrontations, 2005 to 2013. The election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in 2005 marked a significant shift toward conservatism in Iran's domestic and foreign policies. Ahmadinejad, a populist politician, appealed to working-class voters with promises of economic justice, anti-corruption efforts, and a return to the core values of the Islamic Revolution. His presidency also saw increased international tensions, particularly over Iran's nuclear program, which became the focus of intense scrutiny from Western powers. During this time, global leadership played a crucial role in shaping Iran's interactions with the world. George W. Bush in the United States initially pursued a confrontational policy toward Iran, while Nicolas Sarkozy in France and Tony Blair in the United Kingdom supported U.S. efforts to pressure Iran. In Germany, Angela Merkel took office in 2005 and worked to balance European interests with U.S. policies. The transition to Barack Obama in the U.S. in 2009 brought a shift in diplomacy, raising hopes for a new approach toward Iran. Ahmadinejad's populism and domestic policies. Ahmadinejad's victory in 2005 reflected growing disillusionment with the reformist movement. As president, he emphasized economic redistribution and social conservatism, channeling resources into subsidies for essential goods and housing projects aimed at reducing poverty. However, these populist policies soon led to economic mismanagement, rampant inflation, and increased financial instability. Ahmadinejad's administration curtailed political freedoms, cracking down on journalists, activists, and opposition figures. His anti-Western rhetoric and focus on religious conservatism alienated the urban middle class, further deepening the divide between conservatives and reformists. The nuclear program and international sanctions. Iran's nuclear program became the focal point of international concern during Ahmadinejad's presidency. While Iran insisted that its nuclear activities were intended for peaceful energy production, the United States and European nations suspected it was developing nuclear weapons. In response, the United Nations, United States, and European Union imposed severe economic sanctions on Iran. George W. Bush's administration supported these measures, viewing Iran's nuclear program as a threat to regional stability. Nicolas Sarkozy in France and Tony Blair in the UK aligned with U.S. efforts to prevent Iran from advancing its nuclear ambitions, while Angela Merkel in Germany worked to keep diplomatic channels open. The shift to Obama's diplomacy and Iran's response. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 brought a shift in U.S. policy toward diplomacy with Iran. Obama extended a hand to Iran, expressing willingness to engage in dialogue if Iran would limit its nuclear activities. However, Ahmadinejad's government remained defiant, continuing uranium enrichment and resisting international pressure. Despite Obama's diplomatic overtures, relations between Iran and the U.S. remained tense. European leaders, including Nicolas Sarkozy, Angela Merkel, and Gordon Brown, sought to maintain unity with the U.S. while exploring diplomatic solutions. The failure to reach an agreement during this period set the stage for continued confrontations over Iran's nuclear program. The Green Movement and domestic unrest. In 2009, Ahmadinejad's re-election sparked widespread allegations of voter fraud, leading to mass protests known as the Green Movement. Millions of Iranians took to the streets, demanding fair elections and political reform. The protests were met with brutal repression by the government, which deployed security forces to disperse crowds, arrest activists, and silence opposition leaders. The Green Movement reflected growing frustration with the government's authoritarianism and economic mismanagement. Although the protests were ultimately crushed, they left a lasting impact on Iranian politics, signaling that public discontent with the regime would continue to simmer beneath the surface. Regional influence and international alignments. Throughout Ahmadinejad's presidency, Iran sought to expand its regional influence. Iranian-backed militias gained power in Iraq following the fall of Saddam Hussein, and Iran strengthened its alliances with Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. This growing influence heightened tensions with regional rivals such as Saudi Arabia and Israel, complicating efforts to stabilize the region. The Arab uprisings of 2010, known as the Arab Spring, further reshaped the regional landscape. While the protests called for democracy and freedom, Iran's leadership portrayed them as Islamic revolutions inspired by the Iranian model. However, Iran's support for the Assad regime in Syria, which brutally repressed its own uprising, exposed the limits of this narrative. Technological advances and cultural shifts. During this period, The world experienced rapid technological advancements that transformed communication and commerce. The rise of social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter reshaped political movements and provided activists with new tools to organize and share information. In Iran, young people embraced these platforms to express their frustrations, even as the government intensified efforts to restrict online freedom. The influence of technology extended beyond politics, transforming global culture and creating new opportunities for connection and activism. Summary of key events 2005 to 2013. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected president in 2005, marking a shift toward conservatism. Iran's nuclear program led to international sanctions and economic hardship. The Green Movement protests in 2009 demanded political reform but were brutally repressed. Iran expanded its regional influence in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. George W. Bush pursued a confrontational policy toward Iran, focusing on sanctions and containment. Nicolas Sarkozy and Tony Blair aligned with U.S. efforts to pressure Iran, while Angela Merkel sought diplomatic solutions. Barack Obama's election in 2008 brought a shift toward diplomacy, though tensions with Iran persisted. The rise of social media reshaped political movements and cultural expression. Conclusion: the end of the Ahmadinejad era and the need for change. The period from 2005 to 2013 was one of economic challenges, political repression, and diplomatic isolation for Iran. Ahmadinejad's populism and confrontational foreign policy deepened Iran's isolation from the West, while sanctions and mismanagement crippled the economy. The Green Movement revealed widespread discontent with the regime, though the government's ability to suppress dissent ensured that no meaningful reforms were achieved. The transition from Ahmadinejad to Hassan Rouhani in 2013 marked the beginning of a new phase in Iran's political trajectory. As Rouhani campaigned on promises of moderation and reform, many Iranians hoped for a future of economic recovery and renewed international engagement. However, the legacy of Ahmadinejad's presidency would continue to shape the challenges facing Iran in the years to come. Chapter 11: Reform, Sanctions, and the Nuclear Deal, 2013 to 2017. The election of Hassan Rouhani in 2013 marked a shift toward moderation and diplomacy, as many Iranians hoped for economic relief and political reforms after the Ahmadinejad era. Rouhani's government prioritized improving relations with the West, focusing on resolving the nuclear crisis and lifting international sanctions. During this time, global leadership shifted as well. Barack Obama in the United States pursued a diplomatic approach with Iran, while François Hollande in France supported efforts to resolve the nuclear crisis through negotiations. In the United Kingdom, David Cameron led until 2016, when Theresa May succeeded him. Angela Merkel in Germany remained a stabilizing force throughout this period, helping shape European policy toward Iran. The world was undergoing major changes, with growing regional conflicts, technological advancements, and shifting alliances. Although Rouhani's efforts brought some economic improvement, Iran's political structure, dominated by Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards, continued to limit his ability to introduce major reforms. Hassan Rouhani's presidency and economic challenges. Rouhani campaigned on a platform of moderation and engagement with the international community, promising to resolve the nuclear crisis and ease Iran's economic woes. His administration focused on curbing inflation, stabilizing the currency, and reducing unemployment, though his efforts were constrained by the legacy of sanctions and opposition from conservative factions. Many urban middle-class Iranians supported Rouhani's reformist agenda, but hardliners in the judiciary, military, and clergy resisted changes that could weaken their power. Civil liberties remained limited, with activists, journalists, and dissidents frequently imprisoned for criticizing the government. The nuclear agreement, a diplomatic breakthrough. One of the most significant achievements of Rouhani's presidency was the negotiation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, also known as the Iran Nuclear Deal. In 2015, after months of diplomatic talks, Iran and the P5+1 powers, the United States, France, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, and Germany reached an agreement. Iran agreed to limit its nuclear program in exchange for the lifting of international sanctions. The deal was celebrated as a diplomatic success. Barack Obama viewed the agreement as a key achievement of his foreign policy, while François Hollande and Angela Merkel emphasized its importance for regional stability. However, many in the U.S. Congress, along with Israel and Saudi Arabia, opposed the agreement, fearing it would embolden Iran's regional ambitions. Regional conflicts and Iran's influence in the Middle East. During Rouhani's presidency, Iran continued to expand its influence in the region. The rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria created new opportunities for Iran to assert its power. Iranian-backed Shia militias played a key role in combating ISIS, while Iran's support for Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria strengthened its foothold in the region. Iran's growing influence heightened tensions with Saudi Arabia and other regional rivals. The two nations engaged in proxy conflicts across the Middle East, particularly in Yemen, where Iran supported the Houthi rebels against a Saudi-led coalition. These conflicts deepened regional divisions, complicating efforts at diplomacy. Global developments and technological transformations. The world experienced rapid technological advancements during this period. The internet, smartphones, and social media platforms transformed communication, commerce, and political activism. Companies like Apple, Google, and Facebook became dominant forces in the global economy, reshaping how people connected with each other. In Iran, platforms such as Telegram and Instagram became popular among young people and activists, despite government efforts to restrict access. These tools provided new ways for Iranians to express themselves and organize politically, contributing to a vibrant, though often repressed, civil society. The 2016 U.S. election and new challenges for Iran. In 2016, Donald Trump won the U.S. presidential election, signaling a shift in American foreign policy. Trump criticized the nuclear agreement, calling it one of the worst deals in history, and promised to withdraw from it if elected. This development raised concerns in Iran, where many feared that years of diplomatic progress would be undone. European leaders, including Angela Merkel and newly appointed UK Prime Minister Theresa May, expressed their commitment to upholding the JCPOA. However, uncertainty about U.S. policy under Trump cast a shadow over Rouhani's efforts to improve Iran's economy and reintegrate it into the global economy. Summary of key events: 2013-2017. Hassan Rouhani was elected president in 2013, promising moderation and reform. Iran signed the JCPOA with world powers in 2015, leading to the lifting of sanctions. Iran expanded its regional influence in Iraq and Syria during the fight against ISIS. Tensions with Saudi Arabia deepened, fueling proxy conflicts across the Middle East. Barack Obama pursued diplomacy in the Middle East, leading to the Iran nuclear deal. The refugee crisis in Europe created political challenges and fueled populism. Donald Trump's election in 2016 signaled a shift in U.S. foreign policy. Technological advancements reshaped global communication and activism. Conclusion: hope and uncertainty. The period from 2013 to 2017 brought both hope and uncertainty for Iran. The nuclear deal raised expectations for economic recovery and international reintegration, but internal political divisions and regional conflicts limited progress. While Rouhani's government managed to stabilize the economy to some extent, hardliners remained entrenched in key institutions, ensuring that meaningful political reforms remained elusive. The election of Donald Trump cast doubt over the future of the nuclear agreement and Iran's place in the global order. As Rouhani prepared for his second term, Iran faced the challenge of balancing domestic reform, regional influence, and international diplomacy in an increasingly unstable world. Chapter 12: Maximum Pressure and Domestic Struggles, 2017 to 2021. Rouhani's second term as president began with high hopes for economic recovery and improved international relations. However, the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018 marked the beginning of a new era of hostility between Iran and the West. The Maximum Pressure campaign imposed severe sanctions, crippling Iran's economy and intensifying internal discontent. During this period, global leadership changed significantly. Donald Trump in the United States pursued a confrontational foreign policy toward Iran, while Emmanuel Macron in France attempted to salvage the nuclear deal through diplomacy. Theresa May in the United Kingdom maintained alignment with U.S. policies, though she was succeeded by Boris Johnson in 2019. Angela Merkel continued to lead Germany, navigating between European unity and shifting U.S. foreign policies. Iran faced significant domestic protests, growing regional tensions, and the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite these challenges, Iran continued to assert its influence in the Middle East, even as public frustration with economic hardship and political repression grew. The U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear deal and sanctions. In 2018, U.S. President Donald Trump withdrew from the JCPOA and reimposed severe sanctions on Iran. The maximum pressure campaign targeted Iran's oil exports, financial institutions, and trade networks, deepening the country's economic crisis. Inflation soared and the value of the rial collapsed, pushing many Iranians into poverty. European leaders, including Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel, and Theresa May, sought ways to preserve the nuclear agreement and allow humanitarian trade with Iran, but these efforts had limited success. In response, Iran began gradually reducing its compliance with the JCPOA, restarting key aspects of its nuclear program. Internal unrest, protests, and crackdowns. In 2019, the economic crisis triggered mass protests across Iran after a sudden increase in fuel prices. The government responded with a harsh crackdown, killing hundreds of protesters and imposing internet blackouts to limit communication. Public anger over economic mismanagement and political repression fueled the protests, reflecting widespread frustration with both the Rouhani administration and hardliners in the judiciary and military. These protests were part of a broader pattern of unrest across the world, as global economic inequality and dissatisfaction with governments triggered movements for change. Boris Johnson, who became the UK Prime Minister in 2019, focused on domestic issues and Brexit, though his government remained aligned with US policies toward Iran. Geopolitical tensions and the assassination of Soleimani. In 2020, U.S.-Iran tensions escalated dramatically when a U.S. drone strike in Baghdad killed Qasem Soleimani, head of the Quds Force. Soleimani was a central figure in Iran's regional strategy, coordinating efforts in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. His assassination provoked outrage in Iran, where he was seen as a national hero. Iran retaliated with missile strikes on U.S. military bases in Iraq, raising fears of a broader conflict. Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron urged de-escalation, though tensions between Iran and the U.S. remained high. The COVID-19 pandemic and its impact. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 further strained Iran's economy and healthcare system. The government struggled to contain the outbreak, facing shortages of medical supplies due to sanctions. Iran's economy deteriorated as lockdowns disrupted businesses, and oil prices plummeted amid the global economic slowdown. The pandemic also exposed weaknesses in governance. Public frustration grew over the government's lack of transparency and inadequate response to the crisis. Meanwhile, the Trump administration maintained its hardline stance, preventing Iran from accessing international financial relief during the pandemic. Technological advances and social shifts. Despite the political and economic turmoil, Iran's youth embraced technology and social media to demand change. Platforms such as Instagram, Telegram, and Twitter played a crucial role in organizing protests and sharing information. In response, the government intensified efforts to restrict online freedom, imposing internet blackouts during times of unrest. Globally, technological advances continued to reshape communication, industry, and everyday life. The rise of 5G networks, artificial intelligence, and renewable energy technologies transformed global industries, while the pandemic accelerated the adoption of remote work and digital platforms. Leaders like Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron sought ways to navigate the rapid technological shifts, though geopolitical tensions complicated global cooperation. Summary of key events, 2017 and 2021. Hassan Rouhani began his second term in 2017, promising reforms. The U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, reimposing harsh sanctions. Iran faced mass protests in 2019 over fuel prices and economic conditions. Qasem Soleimani was killed by a U.S. drone strike in 2020, raising regional tensions. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated Iran's economic and political crises. Donald Trump pursued a confrontational foreign policy toward Iran. Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel attempted to preserve the JCPOA. Boris Johnson succeeded Theresa May in the UK amid domestic challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted global economies and healthcare systems. Advances in AI, 5G, and renewable energy reshaped global industries. Social media platforms played a key role in political movements worldwide. Conclusion: a nation under pressure. The period from 2017 to 2021 was one of intense pressure for Iran, both domestically and internationally. The withdrawal from the nuclear deal and the reimposition of sanctions pushed the economy to the brink, while protests and the pandemic exposed the government's weaknesses. Despite these challenges, Iran continued to assert its regional influence, showing resilience in the face of isolation and conflict. As Rouhani's presidency came to an end, the election of hardline candidates signaled that Iran's leadership would likely adopt a more conservative approach in the years to come. Leaders like Joe Biden in the US and Emmanuel Macron in France began preparing for a shift in diplomacy, though the prospects for renewing the nuclear agreement remained uncertain. Chapter 13: The Rise of Hardliners and Ebrahim Raisi's Presidency, 2021 to present. The election of Ebrahim Raisi in 2021 marked a decisive shift toward conservatism in Iran. Raisi, a hardline cleric and former judiciary chief, assumed the presidency with a promise to tackle corruption, revive the economy, and resist Western pressure. His presidency signaled the consolidation of power by the hardliners, reversing many of the more moderate policies of the Rouhani era. During this time, key global leaders, including Joe Biden in the United States, Emmanuel Macron in France, Boris Johnson and later Rishi Sunak in the United Kingdom, and Olaf Scholz in Germany, navigated complex relations with Iran. As the world dealt with the fallout from the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Iran faced challenges both domestically and internationally. Ebrahim Raisi, consolidating power and cracking down on dissent. Raisi's election in 2021 came amid widespread public disillusionment with Iran's political system. Turnout was low, reflecting frustration with economic struggles, government repression, and the lack of meaningful political alternatives. Raisi quickly moved to strengthen the position of the hardliners, appointing key allies to government posts and consolidating control over the judiciary and military. In 2022, Boris Johnson led the United Kingdom as the West navigated tensions with Iran over nuclear activities and regional influence. That same year, Rishi Sunak succeeded Johnson amid domestic political upheaval. In France, President Emmanuel Macron continued efforts to maintain diplomatic ties, though his push for nuclear negotiations faced obstacles. Olaf Scholz, who became Chancellor of Germany in 2021, sought a balanced foreign policy amid shifting global alliances. Meanwhile, Joe Biden attempted to revive the JCPOA, though efforts faltered due to resistance on both sides. One of Raisi's top priorities was cracking down on dissent. In 2022, mass protests erupted following the death of Mahsa Amini, a young woman arrested by the morality police for allegedly violating Iran's dress code. The protests, which spread across the country, reflected deep-seated anger over government repression and gender-based restrictions. Raisi's government responded with brutal force, arresting thousands and limiting access to the internet, but the protests revealed a growing demand for change within Iranian society. Economic hardships and international sanctions. Iran's economy remained in a state of crisis, burdened by international sanctions and domestic mismanagement. Inflation soared and unemployment remained high, exacerbating public frustration. The COVID-19 pandemic further strained the economy, while sanctions blocked access to international financial markets and foreign investment. Raisi's government focused on deepening economic ties with China, Russia, and other non-Western countries, seeking to bypass U.S. sanctions. In 2022, Iran joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, signaling a shift toward greater cooperation with Eastern powers. However, these partnerships were limited in their ability to address Iran's deep-rooted economic challenges. Shifting regional dynamics and Iran's foreign policy. The Abraham Accords, normalization agreements between Israel and several Arab states, reshaped the regional balance of power, heightening Iran's concerns about encirclement by rival powers. Iran's regional influence remained strong, however, as it continued to support Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthi rebels in Yemen, and Shia militias in Iraq. At the same time, Saudi Arabia and Iran engaged in back-channel diplomacy aimed at reducing tensions, though deep-seated rivalries persisted. The evolving regional landscape posed both challenges and opportunities for Iran, as it sought to maintain its influence amid shifting alliances. Global context: the Russia-Ukraine conflict and shifting alliances. In 2022, the Russia-Ukraine war created new challenges for the global order, further isolating Russia and deepening tensions between Western powers and Eastern alliances. Iran aligned itself more closely with Russia, providing military drones and other support for Moscow's war efforts. This cooperation led to further Western sanctions on Iran, reinforcing its isolation from the United States, France, the UK, and Germany. Meanwhile, China's rise as a global power influenced Iran's foreign policy. Iran sought to deepen economic ties with China, which had become its largest trading partner. The shifting geopolitical landscape suggested that Iran was increasingly aligning itself with Eastern powers in opposition to the Western-led international order. Technology, youth, and social change. Despite government restrictions, Iran's youth continued to play a pivotal role in demanding change. Social media platforms such as Instagram, Telegram, and Twitter remained crucial tools for activism, even as the government sought to restrict online access. Young Iranians, particularly women, used these platforms to organize protests and share their demands for greater freedoms. Culturally, underground music, cinema, and art scenes continued to thrive, reflecting the resilience of Iranian creativity despite repression. Filmmakers, musicians, and artists found ways to express their views, gaining international recognition while challenging the censorship regime at home. Summary of key events, 2021 present. Ebrahim Raisi was elected president in 2021, signaling a hardline shift. Mass protests erupted in 2022 following the death of Mahsa Amini, demanding greater freedoms. Iran deepened economic ties with China and Russia, joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO. Economic challenges, sanctions, and government repression continued to fuel public discontent. Global history. Joe Biden pursued efforts to revive the nuclear deal, though talks faltered. The Russia-Ukraine war in 2022 reshaped global alliances and isolated Russia. The Abraham Accords transformed regional diplomacy, heightening tensions with Iran. China's rise as a global power influenced Middle Eastern geopolitics. Conclusion: a nation at a crossroads. The rise of Ebrahim Raisi and the hardline consolidation of power marked a new phase in Iran's political trajectory. While Iran's leadership deepened alliances with Russia and China, the country remained isolated from the West, burdened by sanctions and internal unrest. The 2022 protests underscored the growing divide between the government and the population, highlighting the demands of a young, restless society. As Iran navigates economic challenges, regional rivalries, and global realignments, it faces uncertain prospects. The resilience of civil society and the persistence of dissent suggest that calls for change and reform will continue, even in the face of repression. How Iran's leadership addresses these challenges will shape the country's future trajectory in an increasingly interconnected and volatile world. Chapter 14: The Era of Ebrahim Raisi and Shifting Alliances, 2021 to Present. The election of Ebrahim Raisi in 2021 signaled a significant shift in Iran's political landscape toward conservatism. A former judiciary chief known for his hardline stance, Raisi came to power during a period of economic crisis, international isolation, and public discontent. His presidency was marked by intensified repression of dissent, efforts to deepen ties with China and Russia, and a growing focus on bypassing Western sanctions. Globally, this period saw dramatic geopolitical shifts, including the Russia-Ukraine conflict in 2022, growing tensions between the United States and China, and the rise of new global alliances. Joe Biden in the United States, Emmanuel Macron in France, Boris Johnson and later Rishi Sunak in the United Kingdom, and Olaf Scholz in Germany navigated these complex dynamics while managing their nation's relations with Iran. Raisi's hardline policies and domestic repression. Raisi's election followed years of public frustration with moderate reforms under Hassan Rouhani, whose promises of economic recovery had faltered under renewed U.S. sanctions. Raisi quickly consolidated power, appointing key allies to government positions and strengthening control over the judiciary and military. His administration focused on tightening restrictions on civil liberties, increasing surveillance, and cracking down on protests. In 2022, mass protests erupted following the death of Mahsa Amini, a young woman arrested by Iran's morality police for allegedly violating the Islamic dress code. The protests, driven by anger over government repression and gender inequality, spread rapidly across the country. Raisi's government responded with violent crackdowns, arresting thousands and imposing internet blackouts to stifle dissent. Economic struggles and sanctions. Iran's economy remained in dire straits, burdened by international sanctions, inflation, and unemployment. Western sanctions targeting Iran's oil exports and financial system continued to cripple the economy, making basic goods increasingly unaffordable for ordinary Iranians. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated the crisis, further straining healthcare resources and disrupting businesses. With limited options for economic relief from the United States and Europe, Raisi's government turned to China and Russia for economic partnerships. In 2022, Iran formally joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, signaling its alignment with Eastern powers in opposition to the U.S.-led global order. However, these partnerships provided limited economic benefits as deep-rooted structural problems remained unresolved. The Russia-Ukraine war and Iran's global position. The outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict in 2022 reshaped global alliances, drawing China and Russia closer together while further isolating Iran from the West. Iran supplied drones and military support to Russia, deepening its alignment with Moscow, but also provoking new rounds of sanctions from the European Union and the United States. Joe Biden's administration struggled to revive the JCPOA nuclear agreement, as talks stalled over mutual distrust and Iran's demands for sanctions relief. Meanwhile, Emmanuel Macron in France and Olaf Scholz in Germany sought to maintain diplomatic pressure on Iran while managing energy shortages caused by the Russia-Ukraine war. In the United Kingdom, political instability saw the rapid succession of leaders, with Boris Johnson stepping down and Rishi Sunak eventually taking office. Each leader sought to balance the UK's security interests with efforts to engage Iran diplomatically, though little progress was made in improving relations. Technology, social movements, and global shifts. Iran's young population continued to play a central role in demanding political change. Despite heavy government restrictions, activists used social media platforms such as Instagram and Telegram to organize protests and share information with the outside world. These tools became lifelines for communication, even as the government imposed internet blackouts during periods of unrest. At the same time, technological advancements across the globe accelerated. The expansion of artificial intelligence and 5G networks reshaped industries and societies, offering both new opportunities and challenges. While much of the world embraced these advancements, Iran's isolation from global markets limited its participation in this technological revolution. Summary of key events, 2021 present. Ebrahim Raisi was elected president in 2021, consolidating power with a hardline agenda. Mass protests erupted in 2022 following the death of Mahsa Amini, demanding greater freedoms. Iran deepened economic ties with China and Russia, joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The Russia-Ukraine conflict further isolated Iran from the West and drew it closer to Russia. Joe Biden struggled to revive the nuclear deal amid tensions with Iran. Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz balanced diplomatic engagement with concerns over Iran's policies. The United Kingdom saw political changes, with Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak navigating relations with Iran. Technological advancements in AI and 5G reshaped the global economy, though Iran remained largely isolated. Conclusion: a nation at a crossroads. The period from 2021 to the present has been one of profound challenges for Iran. Ebrahim Raisi's hardline policies have intensified repression and deepened Iran's isolation from the West, while economic hardships continue to fuel public frustration. Despite efforts to align with China and Russia, Iran remains economically vulnerable and politically unstable. As protests demanding freedom and equality persist, the resilience of Iran's civil society offers a glimmer of hope for change. However, the future remains uncertain. The outcome of global geopolitical shifts, the persistence of Western sanctions, and the growing demands of Iranian youth will shape the direction of the country in the years to come. Whether Iran can balance its internal challenges with external pressures remains an open question. Conclusion: the continuity of struggle and resilience. Iran's history from the 18th century to the present reflects an enduring pattern of internal challenges and external pressures. From the political fragmentation of the post-Safavid period to the establishment of the Qajar and Pahlavi dynasties, Iran has experienced cycles of reform and repression, innovation and stagnation. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 marked a radical shift, yet it carried forward many of the same tensions that have defined the country for centuries. These include the tension between modernization and tradition, domestic sovereignty and foreign influence, and authoritarianism and the quest for freedom. Throughout this journey, the influence of global powers has shaped Iran's trajectory. The rivalry between Britain and Russia in the 19th century, the Cold War interventions of the United States and Soviet Union, and, most recently, the growing alignment with China and Russia have reflected Iran's strategic importance. However, these alliances have also come at a cost, fueling internal discontent and eroding the state's legitimacy. Iran has shown remarkable resilience in the face of sanctions, isolation, and war, maintaining its identity and influence in the region despite considerable obstacles. The Iran-Iraq War, the Green Movement, the nuclear negotiations, and the 2022 protests are testaments to the people's persistent struggle for dignity and self-determination. The tension between a repressive government and a vibrant civil society continues to shape the nation's present and will determine its future. Iran's trajectory reflects recurring patterns of conflict and adaptation. These include the quest for sovereignty in the face of external domination, the struggle between authoritarianism and reform, and the push for modernization while preserving national and religious identity. As Iran moves forward, these themes will remain relevant. The future lies in the ability of new generations to navigate these challenges, forging a path that honors both the nation's heritage and the need for progress in a changing world. Epilogue: the horizon of possibility. Iran stands at a crossroads. The youthful energy driving movements for change reflects a society unwilling to accept the status quo. The demands for gender equality, freedom of speech, and economic opportunity are growing louder, despite the government's efforts to suppress dissent. At the same time, Iran's strategic alliances with China and Russia offer new opportunities but also risks, as the country aligns itself with powers that could limit its independence in the long run. In an increasingly interconnected world, Iran faces the challenge of balancing its regional ambitions with domestic priorities. As global politics continue to shift, the ability to reintegrate with the international community on fair terms will shape Iran's future. Technology and globalization present both opportunities for empowerment and threats to authoritarian control, forcing the government to adapt or risk losing legitimacy. Iran's story is not unique. It is part of the larger human experience of struggle, change, and renewal. Nations rise, adapt, and fall, only to rise again. The lessons of Iran's past offer insights into its future. Resistance, adaptation, and hope remain constant. The future of Iran will depend not only on the decisions of its leaders, but on the will of its people, who have shown time and time again that they are determined to shape their destiny, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As Iran's journey continues beyond these pages, the story remains unfinished. The youth on the streets, the thinkers in exile, the workers in factories, and the artists in underground spaces all represent threads in the tapestry of Iran's future. What happens next will depend on their voices and the choices they make as they navigate a world of new possibilities and enduring challenges. With this, your book concludes. Yet history is never truly finished. It remains a living narrative shaped by each passing day, each decision, and each generation.